All right, today we're going to tackle a huge question, one that impacts a multi-trillion-dollar industry. Who actually writes the rules for insurance here in the US? Now, this isn't some dry legal question. It's actually a story full of high-stakes court battles and a constant tug-of-war for control that, believe it or not, shapes the policies in all of our lives. So, let's get into it. And this right here is the heart of the whole conflict. I mean, we're talking about a trillion-dollar industry. The stakes just couldn't be higher. So who should call the shots? Do you want one set of rules from Washington, D.C. for everyone? Or is it better to have 50 different rule books, one for each state to allow for local needs? For well over a century, this is the exact question that has fueled a massive debate. Tug of war is really the perfect way to describe this. On one end of the rope, you've got all the individual states, pulling hard for local control. And on the other end, you've got the federal government, pulling for national authority. And what they're fighting over is the power to regulate one of the biggest pieces of the American economy. It's a battle that went all the way to the Supreme Court. And this is where things get wild. Look at this, a complete 180-degree flip. Back in 1868, the Supreme Court says, nope, insurance is not interstate commerce. And just like that, the states got the green light to regulate it. For almost 80 years, that was the law. Then, bam, 1944 comes along, and the court completely reverses itself. Now they say insurance is interstate commerce. All of a sudden, the power swings right over to the federal government. I mean, can you just imagine the chaos? Decades of state-based laws were basically thrown into question overnight. The entire industry was in turmoil. It was pretty obvious that this kind of legal whiplash just wasn't going to work. Somebody had to step in, and that somebody was Congress. They needed to find a real, lasting solution. And that solution came just 1 year later. This brings us to probably the single most important law in this whole story, the McCarran-Ferguson Act. This is the piece of legislation that created the framework we still use today. It's really a fantastic example of a major American compromise. So what did this thing actually do? Well, in a really powerful move, Congress just came out and said it. Having the states regulate insurance is what's best for the public. It handed the primary power right back to the states. But, and this is a huge but, it kept federal power in reserve, especially for big things like antitrust issues. Just in case a state wasn't getting the job done. And they wanted to make sure this new law had some real teeth. So Congress attached some serious penalties. If you violated the McCarran-Ferguson Act, you could be looking at a fine of up to $10,000 or even prison time. This wasn't some friendly suggestion. It was the new enforceable law of the land, setting a very firm boundary for this whole state-led system. Okay, so with that main power struggle finally settled, the system could actually start to evolve. But of course, a whole new set of questions came up. The world was changing, right? New challenges were popping up, things like protecting consumer privacy, fighting financial crime, and then, of course, the rise of the internet. So new federal laws had to be added to the rulebook, which created the layered system we have today. And this timeline really shows that evolution in action. You see, in the 70s, the big focus was on consumer privacy. Then you jump to the 90s, and we see the federal government cracking down hard on fraud. Right at the turn of the millennium, the laws had to adapt to these massive changes in the financial world. And then by 2003, regulation had to play catch-up with new technology like telemarketing and spam email. The system was clearly adapting. And let's just zoom in on that Fraud and False Statements Act for a second. This really shows you how serious federal oversight can get when it wants to. We're talking fines up to 50 grand and prison sentences of up to 15 years if your fraud puts an entire insurance company at risk. It even makes it so convicted felons can't work in the industry unless they get specific written permission. Federal law can also get super practical. Take the CAN-SPAM Act. It basically breaks down the rules for marketing emails into 5 simple steps. Be honest, say it's an ad, include your address, give people an easy way to opt out, and then actually honor that opt-out request quickly. It's a perfect example of a very specific federal rule that applies to absolutely everyone, no matter what state you're in. So what we have is this state-led system with a federal government looking over its shoulder. But that raises a pretty big question, right? How do you keep 50 states from creating 50 totally different, incompatible sets of rules? Well, that's where a couple of key organizations come in, acting as the unofficial referees for the whole industry. This table breaks it down nicely. On one side, you've got the NAIC. That's made up of the actual insurance regulators from every single state. On the other side is NCOIL, which is made up of state legislators who focus on insurance. What they both do is create model laws. Think of them as blueprints for states to use. But here's the key thing to remember. Neither of them can force a state to do anything. They just provide the templates to try and keep things consistent across the country. And this quote from the NAIC really says it all. Their goal is two things. First, create uniformity, so the system works smoothly when you're dealing with different states. And second, to preserve the power of the states to regulate their own industry. So in a way, they're kind of the modern-day guardians of that McCarran-Ferguson compromise. So after all that history, all that back and forth, this is the system we've got today. The states are in the driver's seat for the day-to-day stuff, but you have these national organizations like the NAIC kind of guiding them to keep things from going off the rails. And watching over the whole thing is the federal government, ready to step in on specific issues like fraud, privacy, or antitrust law. And that brings us to the final, really critical question. The foundation for this whole system was laid way back in 1945. That's long before the internet, globalization, or cybersecurity threats were even a thing. So the question we want to leave you with is this. Is a system that was designed for the 20th century still the best way to handle the huge, complex challenges of the 21st? That's a question the industry and frankly all of us are going to have to grapple with.